we've got our pocket door installed in the opening. We've got it plumbed where we want it to be both sides. We've got it plumbed. We've checked how it's going to land against the sidewall whenever my casing is on. Those reveals are all good. So the next step is going to be to shim the split jamb side and the strike side. First things first, you're always going to need a block 3/4 thick or whatever your jamb thickness is going to be to match. This is a 3/4 ripped at 2 3/8 wide, which is generally what all of my split jambs are ripped at. We're going to use this to gauge our shim thickness as we shim out this split side here. So this thing always lives in my door kit in the little drawer under the sys roll. I pull it out whenever I'm doing pocket doors. So how many shims should you be installing and where? In my opinion, I usually do 4 shim points on both sides. So top, bottom, about here, and about here works pretty good. Sometimes I'll do 5, it just kind of depends, but that seems to be enough for me. So now let's take a look at how to do this with cedar shims, which is how most people are going to be accomplishing this task. Cedar shims are going to be readily available, they're going to be on site. So it's always good to use systems that you can easily standardize with standardized materials. Using this method is actually very simple and it's really easy to get an exact fit on these shims. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my cedar shim and I'm going to set it on the 2x on the split jamb. Then I'm going to take my 3/4 inch thick gauge block, which matches my jamb thickness, and I'm going to slide that from the thin side of the shim. I'm going to slide that up the shim until the edge of my gauge block is flush with the edge of the door. Now you'll just pull the gauge block and the shim together off of the split jamb, and you'll use the edge of the gauge block to snap the shim off. And then on the fat end of the shim, that's going to be your shim thickness so that your jamb will sit perfectly flush with the edge of the door. I think this is probably the quickest and most effective way to shim out the split jamb on a pocket door. The key is probably to make sure that whenever you put the door in the opening that you've got it offset far enough off the studs to have a thick enough shim to actually nail on. You just want to make sure you're not too thin. A little tip, whenever you're trying to nail on a really thin piece of wood, you want your nose contact to be further back, that way it doesn't shoot straight through. So if you're shooting like this, that's going to make your nose tip closer and it's going to shoot right through it. But if you want to adjust the depth of your nail set, rock the nailer back, and that's going to make the drive pin make contact further back, and then you won't shoot through that thin shim. The next step in the process is going to be to shim the strike side of the door and then install the piece of flat jamb over those shims. I found that the most effective way to do this is to actually use the door itself to get my shim point. I usually start shimming at the bottom of the door. So what you want to do first is just close the door and let it hit the actual framing stud and see if it's plumb or not. You want to go from whatever point the door is making contact with and add a 1/4 inch to that. So let's just say I'm making contact at the top of the door, but I've got a 1/4 inch gap at the bottom. I actually want to start at the bottom with a 1/2 inch shim. The order of shimming should be to do the bottom, then the top, and then the middle, and then in between the top and the middle, and in between the bottom and the middle. This is going to help you avoid accumulating errors. To get your shim thickness, make sure the door is in the closed position, resting against that bottom shim point that we established as the baseline. Then take your shims from opposing directions and slide them together until your desired thickness just touches the door edge. Repeat this process for all 5 shim points, and then you're ready to nail on the flat jamb. I used to do this whole process with my jammer level, but I've found it's just a lot more effective to use the door edge. Sometimes I use my 15 gauge nailer to nail cedar shims on just because it's so easy to shoot through them with a smaller gauge nailer. I just find that the bigger nail head helps hold them on. Now it's time to nail on the flat jamb. This is 6 9/16 flat jamb, which my lumberyard stocks.
It's more efficient to use these flat jambs because they come ripped at 6 9/16, the edges are eased, and there's a 2-degree bevel on the ends which makes the casing sit better on the jamb. Standard operating procedure for me is to always sand the pieces before I bring them to the opening. Sometimes there's milling marks or scratches that took place during delivery. It's good to get those cleared off before installation. They'll be really ugly after paint is on them. Next step is going to be to take our oscillating multi-tool and cut off all the shims. You want to start with the blade against the jamb and angle it back into the drywall and cut all these shims off. Now it's time to see how we did. Usually the door still requires a little bit of micro shimming. To do that, I just pick up the thin pieces of the shims that I just cut off, and I'll use my pry bar and those thin shims to make that jamb sit perfectly against the door in the closed position and close any gaps that might be there. Sometimes that 2x6 stud is twisted, so what you want to do is make sure to check from both sides whenever you close the door and make sure you're making contact on both edges of the door in the closed position. Now just take your utility knife and use that to cut off these really thin shims, and that side of the door opening is good to go.
I've got my strike side jamb in now, so I'm going to move over to my split jambs next. It really doesn't matter the order that you do them. Shim everything first, and then whether you install the strike first or the split first, it doesn't matter. So the next key tip that I've got for you is to rip some shim, some spacer blocks. These are 3/16 wide. And these come in super handy for getting your reveals right, setting these split jambs. So I keep these with my door kit, again, in that drawer on the sys roll all the time. But you'll see they come in very handy. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my nailer. I'm going to make sure the door is shut in its natural position and it's not manipulated one way or the other. Just let it kind of softly close itself. And I'm going to use my 3/16 spacer block up here. And I'm just going to gently get that space just right. And I'm going to tack it. I'm going to come over here and do the other side. Again, just letting that spacer block just kiss it. Nail that. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom. I'm going to take 2 spacer blocks. I might not have mentioned this, but these split jambs I almost always rip at 2 3/8 wide. With the door, 2 split jambs 2 3/8 wide plus these spacer blocks, it's about perfect. With my door tacked on top, I'm going to come down to the bottom now. I'm going to take 2 spacer blocks and I'm going to sandwich the door in between there, and then I'm going to just kind of feel here and I'm going to center this in the opening. Look for my shim's at. So now I've got it centered bottom and top. I'm going to leave these blocks in there, and now I'm going to grab another spacer block and I'm going to adjust.
FYI, this is often the most cumbersome part of the installation process. Usually you've got your wall that's often bowed, plus often door slabs bowed, so you really just have to roll with the punches and work with what you've got. The key here is that the margins be consistent the whole way up the door.
So I'm going to use my spacer block to set my reveal the whole way up, and I've nailed at my shim points. Next I'm going to remove these 2 spacer blocks down here, put them back in my tool belt, and now I'm going to put in my centering glides.
There is a very specific way that I like to install these glides at the bottom of the door. First, you're going to insert your glides into the door so that they wedge the door tightly in place. Then take your framing square, put them across the top, and make sure they're level on both sides. Now you'll take your screws, screw them all the way at the bottom of that oblong opening. Now loosen the screw a turn and drop that glide down to halfway. So now your screw is in the center of that, and you've got a nice amount of wiggle room between the door and the glides that's going to keep the door from binding up. The painters should always remove these and then replace them after the painting is done. Unfortunately, a lot of times they'll leave them on and just paint over them. So you want to make sure that these are adjusted correctly. Otherwise, if you have to go back and lower them at the end of the job and they're painted over, it leaves a nasty crack line where the paint, where it's not painted underneath. So try to always get these low enough that they're not going to bind the door. Give them plenty of space because it can create issues opening and closing the door if they're too tight. Okay, the last thing we have to do in this process is cut our jamb pieces for the top. Our goal has been to install these jambs with a nice consistent margin and a nice same plane install on these jambs all the way across. So now we've just got to measure the top for our jambs across top. On these top jamb pieces, I rip them and sand them and ease the edges at the same time I do the split jambs. I just leave them at the saw because they have to be measured at the end and then cut to length. So I'm going to go to the saw now and cut those and bring them back. Now there's some important things you need to know at this step of the process of installing these split jambs across the top. The only way you'll ever get this pocket door out of the opening or get access to these nuts to adjust the height or for plumb is to remove one of these sides of the split jamb. Some builders will have you drill 2 3/8 holes, screw it, and then plug it with a button cap, and then not nail the casing across the top into the jamb piece. That way the piece can be removed and therein access the door later on. To me, those button caps look really tacky, and if you install the door right and have it cut at the proper height for flooring, there's no reason the door should ever have to come out. So I don't do the button caps. That being said, I still don't ever want to nail the daylights out of this piece whenever I'm installing it in case it would ever need to come out. A wet LVL under one side of the floor could cause it to shrink or something and throw the door out of plumb where it needs to be adjusted. You still want to be able to have access up there if you absolutely have to, and if you just put a ton of nails in it that's unnecessary, you know, that's not going to help matters any. When you measure for length on these split jambs, you want to be a hair under. You don't want it to be super tight, because what happens is if you're jamming this into place, it could push this over and you could end up with a gap here whenever your door is shut. So you want it to be just a hair undersized. Check your reveal across the top here as you close the door and make sure it's consistent. With paint grade, you can manipulate this a little bit. I'd rather have this be a consistent reveal, even if this jamb and this jamb don't line up perfectly. Like right here, I've got this off a 16th. Caulk is going to fill that. And I know everyone's anti-caulking, but this, nobody will ever know
and this reveal will actually be correct. Sometimes the framing is just not perfect, and that's a way to actually give a better install. The next thing I need to do is I want to take my level and make sure that this is level, because a lot of times it's not.
It would actually probably be better to level and shim this top piece before nailing the jambs on, but sometimes I get a little ahead of myself, so I'm making do where I'm at. I hope you guys have enjoyed this pocket door video series. My goal was to create a set of videos that could get somebody who is relatively green up to speed quickly on how to install a pocket door, as well as maybe give some tips to a veteran carpenter who might be able to pick something up from me. I hope if you guys have something you do different, you let me know in the comment section. I'm always open to suggestions on any way I can improve what I'm doing. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.